The wreckage came in low over the ridgeline just after dawn, trailing black smoke like a funeral shroud across the Afghan sky. Ground crews at Bagram Airfield heard it before they saw it, a sound like metal screaming, tortured and wrong. The A-10 Thunderbolt II dropped through the clouds with one engine dead, the left stabilizer shredded to ribbons, and hydraulic fluid painting a crimson arc behind it. Tower controllers went silent. Someone whispered a prayer. The aircraft shouldn't have been flying at all, let alone attempting a landing with half its control surfaces gone and battle damage that looked like it had flown through a blender. When the landing gear dropped, only 2 of 3, the entire base seemed to hold its breath. The pilot's call sign crackled through the radio, calm as Sunday morning despite the chaos. Tower, Ember 3-1, declaring emergency. I'm coming in hot and I'm coming in ugly. The voice was steady, almost conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than piloting a dying machine filled with 30-millimeter depleted uranium rounds and enough fuel to turn the runway into an inferno. Major Kestrel Vance had been written off 3 hours earlier. Her flight lead reported her aircraft critically damaged during a close air support mission in the Korangal Valley, last seen trailing smoke into a box canyon with Taliban ground fire stitching the sky around her. Search and rescue had been scrambled, then recalled. The operational assumption, spoken quietly, never officially, was that Ember 3-1 had augured into the mountainside and the pilot was gone. Casualty notification officers had already been briefed. Her commander, Colonel Hendricks, had started composing the letter to her family, the one that began with the word regret, and never got easier no matter how many times you wrote it. But here she was, bringing back an aircraft that by all laws of physics and engineering should have been scattered across 6 square miles of hostile terrain. The tower cleared every other bird from the pattern. Crash crews positioned themselves along the runway, foam trucks ready, medics standing by with stretchers they all assumed would be needed. Kestrel's A-10 came in steep and fast, the asymmetric thrust from her single working engine forcing a continuous correction that must have been like wrestling a wounded bear. She compensated with aileron input that should have torn the damaged wing clean off but somehow held. The Warthog hit hard, bounced once, then slammed down again with a screech of tortured metal as the missing gear leg collapsed, and the aircraft slewed sideways in a shower of sparks. It ground to a halt just past midfield, smoke boiling from the engine compartment. Emergency crews converged before the propeller stopped spinning. They found Kestrel still strapped in, hands locked on the stick, eyes forward. When they finally got the canopy open, she looked up at them with a face streaked in hydraulic fluid and smoke residue and said, "Somebody want to tell me why my radio went dead for the last 20 minutes?" Her voice was hoarse but unwavering. The crew chief who helped her out later told everyone in the enlisted club that her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't undo her own harness, but her face never showed it. She climbed down from the wreck, refused the stretcher, and walked on her own power to the debriefing room while behind her the A-10 finally gave up its ghost and began to burn. That was how Colonel Hendricks found her, sitting alone in the ready room with a 1,000-yard stare, still wearing her survival vest, still carrying the weight of whatever had happened in that valley. He stood in the doorway watching her for a long moment before speaking. "I sent the notification team home," he said quietly. Kestrel didn't look up. "Good. Would have been a wasted trip." The silence between them carried the weight of unfinished questions. Hendricks had been in combat aviation for 22 years. He'd seen pilots do extraordinary things under pressure, had written commendations for heroics that belonged in Hollywood rather than in the dusty reality of asymmetric warfare. But something about the wreckage on his runway and the woman sitting before him felt different, felt bigger than the sum of its parts. "Maintenance says that aircraft shouldn't have made it 5 miles, let alone 80, he continued. "They're calling it a miracle." Kestrel finally looked up, and her eyes were hard as flint. "Wasn't a miracle, sir, was anger." The story began 6 months earlier at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where Kestrel Vance had been effectively exiled after what the official record called interpersonal difficulties, and what everyone else called refusing to shut up. She'd been an instructor pilot at the weapons school, one of the few women to hold the position, and by all accounts brilliant at it. Her students consistently scored highest in their class. Her tactical innovations had been incorporated into the curriculum. But Kestrel had made the mistake of reporting her flight commander for cutting corners on safety protocols, and in the fraternal culture of military aviation, that made her a problem. Not the kind of problem they could fire. Her record was too clean, her flight hours too impressive. So they did what institutions always do with inconvenient truth-tellers. They sent her somewhere she couldn't cause trouble. Afghanistan, they told her, would be good for her career. 6 months flying close air support, supporting ground troops, making a difference. What they meant was, we're putting you where nobody important will hear you. Kestrel knew exactly what was happening and went anyway because staying meant admitting defeat. She arrived at Bagram in January when the mountains were white with snow and the cold cut through flight suits like razor wire. The squadron she joined, the 74th Fighter Squadron, the Flying Tigers, had been in-country for 8 months and had the tired, worn look of combat veterans counting down to their rotation home. They were professional, competent, and utterly disinterested in the new major with the spotless flight suit and the reputation for being difficult. Her new squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel named Dre, was blunt during their first meeting. "I don't care what happened at Nellie's," he told her. "Out here we have one job: keep the grunts on the ground alive. You do that, we'll get along fine. You cause drama and I'll have you flying a desk so fast you'll get whiplash." "Clear," Kestrel nodded. "Clear, sir." But clarity and acceptance were different things. The other pilots called her Major Perfect behind her back, sometimes to her face when they'd had enough beers at the makeshift bar in the base recreation tent. She was too precise, too by the book, too unwilling to bend the rules that everyone else treated as suggestions. When she corrected radio procedures, they rolled their eyes. When she questioned marginal weather launches, they ignored her. When she stayed late reviewing mission tapes and identifying areas for improvement, they saw it as showboating rather than dedication. The only person who gave her the time of day was Captain Jonah Reeves, a young pilot on his first combat deployment who hadn't yet learned to treat skepticism as armor. He started asking her questions about tactics, about weapons employment, about the thousand small decisions that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. Kestrel answered them all with a patience that surprised her. "Why do you care what they think?" Jonah asked her once after a particularly brutal ready room session where her careful analysis of a close call had been met with hostile silence. They were walking back to their quarters in the dark, breath fogging in the frigid air. Kestrel was quiet for a long time. "I don't," she finally said. "But I care about bringing everyone home. If that makes me unpopular, I can live with that. Can't live with knowing I could have prevented something and didn't speak up." Jonah nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, some of us are listening." It wasn't much, but it was something. Kestrel held on to that as the weeks turned into months and the missions blurred together. Armed reconnaissance over Helmand Province, close air support for marine operations in Sangin, hours of orbiting at altitude waiting for someone on the ground to need 30 millimeters of salvation. The A-10 was an ugly, ungainly aircraft that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated aesthetics and loved function. Kestrel fell in love with it anyway. The Warthog was built around its gun, a 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds the size of soda bottles at a rate of 65 per second. The aircraft was armored like a flying tank, with redundant systems and a bathtub of titanium surrounding the pilot. It was slow compared to sleek fighters, but it was tough and maneuverable and could loiter for hours while faster jets had to run home for fuel. Most importantly, it could get down in the weeds where the fighting happened, low enough to see the faces of the people you were protecting, close enough to put rounds exactly where they needed to go. Kestrel logged mission after mission, developing an instinct for the work that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She learned to read terrain like a language, to anticipate where insurgents would position themselves, to coordinate with forward air controllers using brevity codes that packed complex tactical information into single words. She learned the weight of responsibility that came with carrying weapons that could erase human beings from existence with a trigger pull. The knowledge that every decision, every second of hesitation or aggression, carried consequences that would echo in someone's life forever. In early June, her squadron supported a special forces team pinned down in a village near the Pakistani border. The radio traffic was desperate, voices tight with controlled panic as they reported being surrounded, taking casualties, minutes away from being overrun. Kestrel and her wingman, a captain named Tors, arrived overhead to find a situation that made her blood run cold. The friendly forces were dug in around a compound with hostiles closing from 3 directions, using civilian structures for cover. The weather was marginal, low clouds, poor visibility. The approved engagement protocols were clear. Without visual confirmation of targets and no civilians in the immediate area, they couldn't employ weapons. Tors, senior on the mission, made the call. Ember flight, negative clearance. Weather's too low, can't confirm targets. Will maintain overwatch but guns stay cold. On the ground, the Special Forces team leader rogered the decision with a voice that already sounded like a eulogy. Kestrel watched the infrared feed from her targeting pod, watched the white-hot signatures of hostile fighters advancing through the village, watched the cluster of friendly signatures growing smaller as they were pushed back into a tighter defensive perimeter. She watched and felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity that cut through regulations and career considerations and the fear of making the wrong choice. Tors, Ember 3-1. I can make that shot. Her wingman's response was immediate and sharp. Negative 3-1. Weather's below minimums. Hold position. Kestrel's hands moved across the cockpit controls, bringing weapons online, setting up the attack geometry. I didn't ask permission. I'm telling you I can make the shot. Those guys are dying down there right now. The radio crackled with tense silence. Then Tors again, harder this time. Ember 3-1, stand down. That is an order. You take that shot and I will personally ensure you never fly again. For a heartbeat, Kestrel hesitated. She thought about Nellie's, about being exiled for speaking truth to power. She thought about Colonel Dre's warning about causing drama. She thought about how easy it would be to do nothing, to follow orders, to let someone else carry the weight of this decision. Then she thought about the men on the ground who had maybe 3 minutes left to live, who had families and futures and dreams that would end in a dusty Afghan compound, because the rules said the weather wasn't quite clear enough to help them. Kestrel rolled in without another word. She dropped through the cloud deck in a diving attack that made her altimeter unwind like a broken clock, broke through at 800 feet above the ground with rock-strewn terrain screaming up at her. The targeting pod locked onto heat signatures moving between buildings. She walked the cannon fire across the enemy position with surgical precision, the GAU-8 roaring its distinctive BRRRRT that sounded like the sky tearing open. 30-millimeter rounds chewed through mud brick walls and fighting positions. She pulled off hard, trading altitude for airspeed, then came back around for a second pass even as Tors was screaming at her over the radio to break off. The second run silenced 2 machine gun positions that had been pouring fire into the compound. The third run sent the remaining hostiles scattering into the hills. When Kestrel pulled off target and climbed back through the clouds, her aircraft untouched and the friendly forces calling out grateful affirmations, she knew with absolute certainty that her career was over. Tors maintained professional silence for the flight back to Bagram. They landed, shut down, and he didn't even look at her as they walked to the operations building. Colonel Dre was waiting. The ass-chewing was legendary, loud enough that every pilot in the squadron heard it through the closed door, professional enough that it never quite crossed into personal attacks. Kestrel stood at attention and took it without defense or excuse. When Dre finally ran out of breath, he stared at her with something that might have been grudging respect buried under layers of command frustration. "You directly disobeyed your flight lead's orders," he said, voice now dangerously quiet. "You violated weather minimums. You employed weapons outside approved parameters." Kestrel met his eyes. Yes, sir. And you do it again. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, every time. Dre's jaw worked as he processed that. The Special Forces team you saved sent a message through channels. They want to know your name so they can thank you personally. 12 men who are alive right now because you decided rules mattered less than lives. He paused, and something in his expression shifted. I should ground you, should probably court-martial you for good measure. But those 12 men have families who will get to see them again. So instead, I'm going to officially reprimand you, put a letter in your file that will kill any chance of promotion, and make your life here just unpleasant enough that you'll think twice before pulling a stunt like that again. Then, unofficially, I'm buying you a beer and never speaking of this conversation. Kestrel felt something loosen in her chest. Understood, sir. But the squadron's attitude didn't change overnight. Anything, her unauthorized heroics made things worse. The other pilots saw it as grandstanding, as Major Perfect proving she was better than everyone else by breaking the very rules she usually championed. Torres refused to fly with her again. Her tactical innovations in the mission debriefs were met with colder silence than before. Only Jonah Reeves, young and idealistic enough to still believe courage should be celebrated, treated her the same, which earned him his own share of isolation from the group. Kestrel accepted it. She'd made her choice and would live with the consequences. She kept flying, kept doing her job with the same precision and dedication, kept speaking up when she saw safety issues even though it made her more of a pariah. And she tried not to think about what would happen when this deployment ended, and she returned to a career that had no place left for someone who'd been officially reprimanded for saving lives. Then came the morning of August 7th, when everything changed. The mission briefing was routine, close air support for an Army convoy moving through the Korangal Valley, that nightmarish stretch of mountain terrain that had earned the nickname Valley of Death for the sheer number of coalition troops who died fighting in its shadowed defiles. Intelligence reported moderate enemy activity, but intelligence was always wrong, either overestimating threats and wasting resources or underestimating them and getting people killed. Kestrel and her new wingman, a taciturn captain named DeMarco who'd been forced to fly with her after Torres refused, took off into a morning sky that was crystalline blue and beautiful in the way that combat zones sometimes are when no one's shooting. The A-10s climbed to altitude, loaded with a full combat loadout, 500 rounds of 30mm ammunition, rockets, and Maverick missiles. They checked in with the ground controller, callsign Titan 6, a forward air controller embedded with the Army unit. His voice came through calm and professional. Ember Flight Titan 6, good morning. We're currently moving through Checkpoint Bravo, no contact at this time. Maintain high cover, we'll advise if we need you down in the weeds. Kestrel rogered and settled into the rhythm of the mission, orbiting at 15,000 feet, scanning the ridgelines with her targeting pod, watching the convoy's progress through the valley floor. It was a familiar ballet of coordination and patience. For 90 minutes, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. Ember Flight, Titan 6 troops in contact. Multiple firing positions, ridgeline north and south. We are taking heavy fire from all sides. The controller's voice had lost its calm, replaced by the clipped urgency of someone trying to coordinate chaos. In the background, Kestrel could hear the staccato crack of rifle fire and the deeper bass of explosions. DeMarco responded first. Titan 6 Ember 1-1, rolling in from the south, talk me on. Kestrel was already banking hard, diving toward the valley, eyes scanning for the source of fire. The targeting pod showed heat signatures scattered across the northern ridgeline, fighters with weapons moving between positions. Ember 3-1 has multiple targets north ridgeline. Request clearance hot. Cleared hot, cleared hot. Get some rounds on that position now. Titan 6's voice cracked with stress. Kestrel lined up her attack, the cannon pipper in her heads-up display settling over the target area. She squeezed the trigger and felt the aircraft shudder as the GAU-8 unleashed its fury, rounds impacting in a line of explosions that walked across the rocky terrain. She pulled off hard, climbing back to altitude as DeMarco rolled in for his run. For the next 20 minutes they worked the valley systematically, identifying firing positions, coordinating attacks, putting precision fire exactly where the ground controller needed it. It was brutal, exhausting work that required absolute concentration. Kestrel's flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cool air at altitude. Her shoulders ached from the constant maneuvering. But they were winning. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped. The convoy was moving again, pushing through the kill zone towards safer ground. Ember Flight, Titan 6, outstanding work. You just saved our bacon. We're almost clear, maintain cover for another 5 mics, then you're cleared to RTB. Kestrel allowed herself a moment of relief. 5 more minutes and they could head home, refuel, and do it all again tomorrow. That's when the missile warning lit up her cockpit like a Christmas tree, screaming that death was racing toward her at twice the speed of sound. The surface-to-air missile came from her 4 o'clock, a bright streak of smoke and rage that gave her maybe 2 seconds to react. Kestrel's hands moved on pure instinct, chaff and flare, braking hard left, pulling G-forces that grayed her vision. The missile corkscrewed past, missing by what felt like inches, and detonated above her in a black flower of shrapnel. But it wasn't alone. The second missile tracked true despite her maneuvers, and she watched in surreal slow motion as it closed the distance. She pulled harder, harder, feeling the airframe groan in protest, feeling her vision tunnel down to a pinpoint. Not enough. The warhead detonated 30 feet from her aircraft's tail section. The blast wave hit like a giant's fist, slamming her forward against the harness hard enough to crack her helmet's visor. The snap rolled inverted, systems screaming warnings in a cacophony of electronic panic. Engine fire, hydraulic failure, flight control malfunction, every master caution light on the panel illuminated. She fought the stick, managed to roll wings level, then felt the aircraft shudder as the left engine tore itself apart and went silent. The smell of burning electronics and hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit. Ember 3-1 is hit. I'm hit, she called, fighting to keep her voice steady. Left engine out, multiple systems down, losing altitude. DeMarco's voice came back tight with controlled fear. 3-1, Ember 1-1, I've got your 6. You're trailing smoke bad. Eject, eject, eject. The ejection handles glowed in her peripheral vision, promising salvation. A rocket right out of this dying aircraft, a parachute, a chance at survival. Standard procedure for catastrophic damage was simple. Get out, live to fly another day. The aircraft could be replaced. She couldn't. Kestrel's hands didn't move toward the handles. Instead, she looked at her fuel gauge, her weapons status, her damage control panel. One engine still running. Partial flight controls. Maybe 20 minutes of flying time before something else failed catastrophically. Below her, somewhere in that valley, the convoy was still vulnerable. The fighters who'd fired those missiles were still out there. And if she ejected now, she'd come down in some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan, miles from any friendly forces, with insurgents who would love to capture or kill an American pilot. The calculus was instant and absolute. She could save herself and maybe die anyway, or she could use what was left of her aircraft to finish the mission. Negative on the ejection, Kestrel said, her voice surprisingly calm. Still got one engine and guns. I'm staying with it. Are you insane? DeMarco's professional composure cracked. That bird's coming apart. Get out now. Kestrel ignored him, turning her crippled warthog back toward the valley, back toward the smoke and fire and the enemy positions that had just tried to kill her. Titan 6, Ember 3-1, I have eyes on your missile launch site. Request clearance to engage. The ground controller's response carried disbelief. 3-1, you're supposed to be punching out. We can handle it from here. Negative, Titan 6. These guys just used an SA-7 on me. That's high-end weaponry, probably have more. They shoot at your hellos when you extract. Somebody's dying today. Better me than them. Found the position. A cluster of heat signatures around a small compound on the ridgeline, exactly where the missiles had originated. Cleared hot, Titan 6 said quietly. Godspeed. Kestrel rolled in one more time, aircraft bucking and shaking, warning alarms screaming their disapproval. She put the cannon pipper on target and held down the trigger until the gun ran dry, until every last round had been delivered downrange. The compound disappeared in a storm of explosions and debris. She pulled off target with the airframe groaning in protest, climbed weakly on her single engine, and pointed the nose toward Bagram. 80 miles of hostile mountains stood between her and safety. DeMarco formed up on her wing, talking her through the damage he could see from outside: shredded tail section, hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple ruptures, pieces of stabilizer missing, scorch marks across the entire left side. "You should have ejected," he said, and his voice carried something new. Something that might have been respect. "Probably," Kestrel agreed, fighting to keep the aircraft level as systems continued to fail. "But then you'd have all the paperwork." The flight back was an eternity compressed into 40 minutes. Every moment brought new failures: the second hydraulic system, the backup flight controls, the landing gear indicator. Her shoulder harness had failed in the missile blast, forcing her to brace herself against the canopy with one arm while flying with the other. The pain was distant, unimportant. What mattered was keeping the aircraft flying, keeping the nose pointed toward home, keeping the single remaining engine running just a few more minutes. She crossed the mountains at 8,000 feet, barely clearing the peaks, then began the long descent toward Bagram. That's when she lost radio communications, the final insult in a cascade of failures. She was alone with her thoughts and the dying aircraft and the knowledge that if this landing went wrong, there would be no second chance. The base appeared in the distance, a brown smudge against the desert floor. Kestrel began running through the emergency procedures from memory, preparing for a landing that would require every bit of skill and luck she possessed. She had no way to tell the tower she was coming in, no way to hear their clearance or advice. She would have to trust they saw her on radar, trust they'd clear the pattern, trust that whatever happened next would somehow work out. The A-10 descended through the dawn light, trailing its dark banner of smoke, carrying a pilot who had refused to quit, refused to eject, refused to let the mission end in anything but completion. On the ground, people watched and waited and wondered who would walk away from the wreckage. In the cockpit, Kestrel Vance, Major Perfect, the difficult one, the pilot nobody wanted, prepared to either save her career or end it in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Her hands were steady on the controls, her mind was clear, and when she brought that wounded warthog down through the final 1,000 feet, she flew it like the warrior she'd always been, whether anyone else had noticed or not. The impact, when it came, was violent and final and perfect. She was alive, the aircraft was destroyed, and everything that came after would be different. That first night after the crash landing, Kestrel sat alone in her quarters and tried to process what had happened. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could hurt. Medical had cleared her, miraculously free of major injuries despite the violence of the missile blast and subsequent crash landing. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking when she thought no one was looking. Post-traumatic stress, probably. The body's delayed reaction to stress the mind had suppressed during the crisis. She'd see the flight surgeon tomorrow for a proper evaluation. Tonight, she just wanted silence. The knock on her door came at 2200 hours. Colonel Dre stood in the corridor, still in his flight suit, looking older than his 47 years. "Mind if I come in, Major?" It wasn't really a question. Kestrel stepped aside and let him enter the small room that had been her home for 6 months. Dre sat heavily on the edge of her bunk, staring at his hands for a long moment before speaking. DeMarco gave his statement, said you should have ejected, said any reasonable pilot would have punched out and been done with it. He looked up at her. Said instead you turned back into the fight with half an aircraft and finished the mission. Said you saved that convoy from a follow-on attack that would have killed a dozen men. Kestrel remained standing, suddenly exhausted beyond words. "Just did my job, sir." "No," Dre said firmly. "You did a lot more than that, and I need to know why. Because the Kestrel Vance I thought I knew was a by-the-book pilot who followed procedures to the letter. That's not who flew today, so who are you really?" It was a fair question. Kestrel sat down across from him, suddenly needing to tell someone the truth she'd carried alone for too long. "My call sign," she began quietly. "Ember, do you know how I got it?" Dre shook his head. "Weapons school," Kestrel continued. "Final training mission, we were running a close air support scenario. My student pilot, kid named Thompson, froze up when we took simulated ground fire, just completely locked up on the controls. We were 30 seconds from a simulated crash when I took the aircraft and recovered, but I didn't report it. Didn't want to wash him out for one mistake. Thought I could coach him through it. Her voice grew quieter. 2 months after he graduated, Thompson deployed to Afghanistan. First mission, he took ground fire and froze again. But there wasn't an IP in the back seat to take the aircraft. He flew into the ground at 400 knots. Him and his wingman, Captain Rodriguez, both killed instantly. The silence in the room was absolute. Dre waited, understanding this was a confession that needed to finish. The investigation found the maintenance records I'd falsified to cover up Thompson's mistake during training. I got an Article 15, but they couldn't prove intent, so it didn't stick. Officially, I was clean. Unofficially, everyone knew what I'd done, tried to protect a student who wasn't ready to fly, and it killed him. Kestrel's voice cracked slightly. They started calling me Ember after that, as in what's left after you burn everything down, as in the wreckage. I accepted the call sign because I deserved it, because I needed to remember what happens when you bend the rules, even for good reasons. Dre absorbed this, his expression unreadable. So when Torres told you to stand down during that rescue mission, you defied him because this time I knew the rules were wrong, Kestrel finished. Thompson died because I wasn't strict enough. Those special forces guys would have died if I'd been too strict. The difference is knowing when the rules serve the mission and when they get in the way. That's the lesson I bought with 2 lives. I'll be damned if I waste it. The squadron commander nodded slowly. And today, the missiles. Today I had a choice between definitely dying on the ground after ejection or probably dying in the aircraft but finishing the mission. The math wasn't complicated, sir. For the first time since entering, Dre smiled, small and sad and proud. You're being put in for a Silver Star. The convoy commander, Titan 6, and DeMarco all submitted statements. Said you saved dozens of lives. The Pentagon loves that kind of story. Female combat pilot refuses to quit, brings back a destroyed aircraft, eliminates high-value targets. You're about to become very famous, Major Vance. Kestrel felt something cold settle in her stomach. I don't want to be famous, sir. I want to fly. You will, but it's going to be different now. The same people who called you difficult are going to want to be in every photo op. The same command structure that exiled you is going to parade you around as evidence they support women in combat roles. It's going to be exhausting and fake, and you'll hate every second of it. He stood, moving toward the door. But maybe, just maybe, some young female pilot who's getting pushed out for being difficult will see your story and know she's not alone, that it's possible to survive this career by being competent instead of compliant. That's worth something, isn't it? Kestrel thought about the girl she'd been at 22, reporting for her first squadron assignment with stars in her eyes and the absolute certainty that excellence would be enough. She thought about every compromise she'd refused to make, every fight she'd chosen when silence would have been easier, every bridge she'd burned because the alternative was becoming someone she couldn't live with. Yeah, she said finally. That's worth something. Dre paused at the door. For what it's worth, I should have listened to you from the beginning. Should have recognized that difficult and right often look the same from the outside. I'm sorry it took you almost dying for me to figure that out. After he left, Kestrel lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere on the base, maintenance crews were cataloging the damage to her aircraft, the hundreds of points of failure that should have meant her death. Tomorrow, she'd give formal statements to the investigation board. Next week, probably, the media circus would begin. But tonight, she was just a pilot who'd survived something she shouldn't have, carrying the weight of all the small choices that had led to this moment. Her call sign still meant Ember, still carried the weight of lives lost to her mistakes. But maybe it could mean something else too. The ember that refuses to die. The spark that persists even when everything around it turns to ash. The beginning of something new rising from what was destroyed. Outside her window, the Afghan night was quiet for once. No explosions, no incoming fire, just stars wheeling overhead in ancient patterns. Kestrel closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, slept without nightmares. The investigation board convened 3 days later in a secure conference room that smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic tension. Kestrel sat at the witness table in her dress blues, 3 rows of ribbons on her chest, and faced a panel of senior officers who would determine whether she'd committed heroism or recklessness, or some complicated combination of both. The lead investigator, a humorless brigadier general named Cartwright, reviewed the mission footage with the detachment of someone who'd never had to make life-or-death decisions at 400 knots. Major Vance, walk us through your decision-making process when the missile warning activated. Kestrel kept her answers precise, factual, free of emotion. She described the attack geometry, the timing of her defensive maneuvers, the damage assessment, the tactical situation on the ground. She explained why ejection would have meant capture or death in hostile territory, why the convoy remained at risk from additional SAM sites, why continuing the mission was the least bad option among a menu of terrible choices. Cartwright listened with the expression of someone who'd already reached his conclusions. And it never occurred to you that preserving coalition pilot life was more valuable than engaging in what was essentially a revenge strike against an already neutralized enemy position. The room went very quiet. Kestrel felt the familiar anger rising, the same anger that had gotten her exiled from Nellie's, that had made her a pariah among her peers. But this time she channeled it into something colder and more effective. With respect, General, those insurgents weren't neutralized. They just demonstrated possession of surface-to-air missiles that posed a direct threat to any helicopter insertion or evacuation in that valley. Leaving them operational would have meant American casualties the next time we needed to move troops through that area. I neutralized a threat. That's not revenge. That's tactics. One of the other panel members, a colonel with close air support experience, nodded slightly. Cartwright's expression didn't change. Your aircraft was critically damaged. You had no way to know the extent of the structural failures. By any reasonable standard, continuing to fly constituted an unacceptable risk. Flying combat aircraft over hostile territory constitutes an unacceptable risk, sir, Kestrel replied evenly. We accept it because the mission demands it. I assessed that I had sufficient control to make one more attack run and return to base. I was correct. Barely, Cartwright shot back. The maintenance report indicates your aircraft was minutes from catastrophic structural failure. You got lucky, Major, and the Air Force doesn't give medals for luck. The experienced colonel leaned forward. But we do give medals for judgment under pressure. Major Vance made tactical decisions that resulted in 0 friendly casualties, elimination of a high-value target, and successful recovery of the aircraft and pilot. That's not luck, Cartwright. That's skill. The debate continued for another hour, but Kestrel could sense the tide had turned. The board wasn't unanimous. Cartwright clearly believed she'd taken unnecessary risks, but the majority recognized something he couldn't see. Not because he was incompetent, but because he'd never been in that specific situation where every choice was wrong, and you had to pick the least wrong option and live with the consequences. When they finally dismissed her, she walked out into the harsh Afghan sunlight feeling drained but vindicated. Damar.